So, you mentioned that she's captured, she's enslaved. In your story, there's an enslaved person. There are different levels of like modernity in these different historical eras.
Yeah.
So, how do you think about approaching stories that have, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say like more like barbaric sort of
Yeah.
like social mores for modern readers?
So one thing I do tell all my readers is that because you're reading historical, especially because anything really prior to like the Enlightenment is really going to be dark and rough. You're just the nature of the kind of, like you said, the cultural mores, the what's accepted by society, just how you had to live and survive in those time periods, what was going on politically, what was going on with, conflicting like clans and, tribal loyalties and all that type of stuff. It was just a darker era. We just like torture was just a thing. Like it's so it was very it's very complicating, but I try to make sure that my readers know, like, hey, this is accurate for the time period. So when you're going in, it's at the bottom of a lot of my book excerpts is like it reflects real historical, aspects of the time period, which might be, which tend to be darker. And then on my webpage, I do have like a list of like some of the different triggers, which admittedly does need to be updated. I've written a couple books that need to update it, but I let my readers know there are darker elements that do directly reflect the history. So if you're familiar with like these types of things, if you've seen Spartacus, you have an idea of how dark that can get. And so I do think it's important because a lot of times historical readers will think, oh, it's like a rom-com, or like I've seen Bridgerton, so I know all about historical romance. And it's like, not so much. We've tried to get rid of some of the more problematic, especially with regards to consent and everything, but dealing with stuff like issues of slavery and that was the norm for many
Mm-hmm.
cultures, many places, through most of history. That's just an you know unappreciable fact. But it also kind of helps that we're dealing with the Romans, and the way the Romans did, kind of their enslaved peoples was very different from how we understand it today. So I think the space of time, that distance of time, and the structure of how that was done, like, you had these, people that were colonized, that were these defeated peoples that they had, what's the word I'm looking for? These defeated
Subjects.
peoples that they have, yeah, that they had managed to subjugate because they conquered them in battle. I think that's got a whole different like presentation, which makes it, I don't want to say easier to deal with at any such an age, but just gives you that time and that distance and that space where it's problematic and you can address how it's problematic, but also show how it's just a reflection of what the daily culture was.
Yeah. Well, and I think readers have different levels of tolerance and interest, and it can be something that someone's looking for, especially, I know Celeste Barkley, who you mentioned before we started recording, is a connection, like the dark mafia romance and other sorts of dark romance, like those contemporary readers might find something very interesting in the historical romances that do take us back to this type of dynamic.
That's one thing I do mention to people. Like, if you are a dark romance fan, if you're into like the mafia romances, if you're into like the, I'm trying to think like the Haunting Adeline, if you're into some of those, the MC biker romance, like if you're into those ones that are edgier and darker, definitely pick up a historical romance that's like Renaissance, medieval, earlier, because you will get a lot of those things, because that's just how society and culture and norms were. And it was just a weird, unfortunate facet of history, but it also, I think, makes it more like immersive. Like you're able to kind of, because sometimes with dark romance, people are like, oh, that's so problematic today, whereas if it seemed like, well, that was normal for that society in the Middle Ages, like it makes it maybe less like triggering or problematic for some people, because they can understand like why it's there, as opposed to something where it's 2024 and you're reading like,
Right. It's
whoa,
less of
that's,
like, I'm endorsing this by reading it.
yes,
It's
that
more
I think is
like,
a really great way. Like, okay, I'm just seeing like what the world was like at that time period. And it's a good thing we don't do that anymore. So I can read it in a historical, but I struggle with it in a contemporary, because that's not the world we live in anymore. Or it seems like I'm advocating or endorsing something problematic. And you're not. You can read what you want. Like, I'm not going
yeah.
to yuck anyone's yum. Like, you read what you want to read. It's obviously not reality. Reading's an escape for a reason, but some people still struggle with that. And so historical romance is a way to kind of do an end run around maybe some of those more problematic issues that we wouldn't want to read about in contemporary romance.
Yeah, absolutely.